In the soft glow of gaslight, the Victorian age questioned everything, including the limits of women's minds. Tonight, you'll drift through quiet lecture halls, strange experiments, and forgotten debates where scientists claimed too much thinking could harm a lady's health. Close your eyes, slow your breath, hit the subscribe button, and let's explore how reason, fear, and a few determined women quietly changed the story of intelligence. It began in quiet lecture halls lit by gaslight. You sit among gentlemen in stiff collars, the air thick with tobacco and chalk dust. The year is 1870. The Royal Society debates whether the female mind is capable of sustained thought. The question sounds absurd to you, yet it commands serious attention among the men who claim to represent science itself. Victorian England prided itself on progress. Railways stitched the country together, steamships conquered oceans, and telegraphs shrank time. Yet inside the halls of learned men, another frontier was under discussion: the limits of the female brain. Could women, long confined to the parlor and the nursery, survive the intellectual strain of higher learning? Or would too much study ruin their nerves, their health, and their reproductive future? You might imagine this question arose from curiosity. It did not. It arose from fear. The Industrial Revolution had restructured everything: labor, class, and family. Education was next. Girls were beginning to attend schools modeled after boys' academies. Some even sat for public examinations. A few daring women, like Elizabeth Garrett Anderson and Sophia Jex-Blake, tried to study medicine. These small acts of defiance unsettled an empire that defined itself by order. In 1869, a Cambridge professor named Henry Maudsley published an essay that would define the era's thinking. It was titled Sex in Mind and in Education. Maudsley argued that women who engaged in excessive intellectual labor would divert vital energy away from their reproductive organs. The result, he warned, would be infertility, madness, and a nation of barren thinkers. He believed this to be scientific fact, not prejudice. His ideas rested on older medical theories that treated the human body as a system of competing energies. To think too much was to drain the blood from the womb. Women, Maudsley said, could learn, but only in moderation. Just as a flower must not be overwatered, the female brain must not be overworked. The metaphor sounded kind. It was not. It was an intellectual cage. Many men agreed with him. Francis Galton, Darwin's cousin and the founder of eugenics, went further. He began collecting measurements of skulls and brains, convinced that biology proved female inferiority. He weighed brains in jars, cataloged foreheads in photographs, and built charts that ranked intelligence by race and gender. The numbers appeared objective, but the purpose was political. Meanwhile, women's colleges were opening quietly in London and Cambridge. They offered mathematics, philosophy, and Latin, subjects long forbidden. At Girton College, one of the first institutions for women, students lived under constant scrutiny. Visitors came not to celebrate them, but to study them, like scientists examining unusual birds. "Do they faint often?" one journalist asked. "Do they still wish to marry?" The public was fascinated by the idea of women scholars. Newspapers described them as curiosities. Satirical cartoons showed young women reading until their eyes bulged, their corsets burst, and their fiancés fled in terror. Humor softened cruelty, as it often did in the Victorian age. You can picture one of those lectures at the Royal Society. A man in his 40s, coat buttoned high, explaining why the female cranium is smaller by 2 ounces. He points to a diagram on a board. He does not mention that women's bodies were, on average, smaller overall. The audience nods. The conclusion seems tidy. The debate continues with applause. Yet, in small rooms across London, women began conducting their own experiments. Not in laboratories, but in libraries and kitchens. They read science journals. They exchanged essays. They taught one another. Mary Putnam Jacobi, an American physician studying in Paris, wrote a groundbreaking paper titled The Question of Rest for Women During Menstruation. It directly refuted the claim that women became mentally unfit for study each month. Her method was rigorous. Data tables, case studies, measured pulse rates. The conclusion was simple. Thinking did not harm women. Lack of opportunity did. The paper won a prize from Harvard Medical School in 1876. Still, universities in Britain remained unmoved. Oxford and Cambridge would not grant full degrees to women for decades. Imagine the frustration. To be intelligent, curious, capable, and told that curiosity could damage your health. Some women internalized the warning. Others quietly ignored it. In parlors and drawing rooms, they debated how much study was too much. Mothers worried that daughters might become unmarriageable. Fathers feared ridicule. Society policed women's ambition with a velvet glove. The strangest part is how respectable it all seemed. Pseudoscience came dressed in Latin words and polite discussion. The question, should women think too much, sounded academic, but it masked an older anxiety. What happens when the world's order shifts? When those once silent begin to speak? As steam and steel reshaped the world, another revolution was happening behind closed doors. A generation of women, told their minds were fragile, began to test that claim in quiet defiance. Some wrote letters. Some conducted experiments. Some simply kept studying. Their resistance was not loud. It was slow, deliberate, and relentless. Outside, the city changed. Gaslight glowed over wet cobblestones. Omnibuses rattled past new libraries. The printing press turned out pamphlets on women's health and education. The debate spread beyond science. It became a question of civilization itself. If women could think, what else might they do? That question frightened the establishment more than any experiment ever could. You wake to the soft tick of a clock in a drawing room that smells of tea and polished wood. It is London in the 1870s, a city balanced between superstition and science. Gas lamps flicker outside. Inside, women sit at tables with pens and journals, writing cautiously. They call themselves students, but to the men who run universities, they are intruders. The intellectual life of a Victorian woman was an exercise in restraint. She was encouraged to read, but not too deeply, to think, but not too long, to express intelligence, but with charm. This balance was fragile, maintained by etiquette as much as by fear. Respectability was a laboratory of its own. Every opinion was an experiment. Every conversation a test of boundaries. At Girton College, the first residential college for women in England, that balance became visible. Established in 1869 by Emily Davies and Barbara Bodishin, Girton students studied algebra, philosophy, and natural science. The women paid for their education by subscription and endured the mockery of newspapers that called the college a nunnery of the learned. Still, they persisted. The dormitories were cold. The corridors echoed. Yet inside each small room, candles burned late into the night. The students were expected to behave as both scholars and models of moral virtue. They rose early, wrote essays by hand, and dined under portraits of men who had once banned their entry. Outside Girton's walls, critics watched closely. If one student fell ill, the newspapers blamed her studies. If one failed an exam, editors claimed her mind had proved too tender for logic. The college physicians were pressured to report on the girl's health. Even a headache could become political evidence. Dr. Henry Maudsley, the same man who warned against female education, visited several times. He believed he was observing the effects of intellectual strain. He noted pale faces, quiet tempers, and fatigue. He ignored the poor heating, the long study hours, and the strict diet of boiled meat and porridge. When a few students fainted, he published an article titled "Overwork in Female Students." His conclusion: women could not handle rigorous study without risking mental collapse. But another doctor, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, disagreed. As the first woman to qualify as a physician in Britain, she examined female students and found them perfectly healthy. She argued that fainting came from social pressure, not science. In her words, "The mind grows by use as the limb by exercise." Her statement was calm, clinical, and quietly revolutionary. While the doctors debated, women continued to read. One of them, a young student named Eleanor Mildred Sidgwick, would later become Girton's principal. She was known for her sharp mind and quiet discipline. Her husband, Henry Sidgwick, taught philosophy at Cambridge, and supported women's education, a rare stance for the time. The couple's marriage became a model of intellectual partnership. They read each other's drafts, debated logic over dinner, and refused to let convention decide who should think more. In another corner of Victorian science, anthropology began to shape the same debate. Male scientists collected skulls from around the world, measuring civilization through bone. The idea was to prove a hierarchy: men above women, Europeans above everyone else. It was a pseudoscience of domination, disguised as discovery. In 1873, a French scientist named Paul Broca published his findings on brain size and intelligence. He noted that male brains were larger. Therefore, he argued men must be smarter. Few questioned his method. He measured cadavers from hospitals, mostly poor and malnourished. The difference in size proved nothing about intellect, yet his work spread across Europe. Victorian doctors cited it to justify educational limits for women. One London reviewer wrote, "The evidence is final. The female brain is a refined instrument, but too delicate for stress." That sentence appeared in popular magazines read by middle-class families. Science had become dinner-table conversation. Wives and daughters read these articles with quiet discomfort. The men reading beside them nodded. The tension grew sharper when women began publishing scientific papers. Mary Somerville, a Scottish mathematician, was one of the first. She translated and explained Laplace's Mécanique Céleste, a work of complex celestial mechanics. Her intellect earned her recognition from the Royal Astronomical Society, though she was not allowed to attend meetings. The Society's charter excluded women. Her certificate was signed in her absence. In public, she was praised as a lady genius. In private letters, male scientists described her as an exception, proof that most women should not attempt the same. Her success was celebrated but isolated, as if one brilliant mind could cancel the argument for equality. By the 1880s, small cracks appeared in the foundation of this pseudoscience. Women passed exams at Cambridge and London universities, often with higher marks than men. The data embarrassed the establishment. Professors began to shift their reasoning. Some now argued not that women lacked ability, but that education would disturb their natural grace. The logic bent to preserve hierarchy. Meanwhile, in America, female students at Vassar and Wellesley conducted experiments on fatigue, measuring pulse and temperature before and after study. Their results showed no decline in health. Newspapers ignored the findings. Pseudoscience was more entertaining. Back in England, the phrase "too much thinking" entered casual speech. Mothers warned daughters about mental strain. Advice columns recommended pleasant reading over mathematics. Female ambition became a medical risk. And yet, in quiet defiance, women gathered in reading societies. They studied the stars, the microscope, and the chemical table. Their rebellion was methodical. They treated learning as a moral duty, not an act of rebellion. The more society told them to rest, the harder they worked. By 1890, the debate had shifted from science to culture. Universities could no longer deny women entry entirely. Instead, they created separate rules. Women could attend lectures but not sit for full degrees. They could observe but not claim credit. The gesture was polite exclusion, masked as inclusion. For the scientists who resisted them, it was a question of control, not capacity. To accept female intellect was to accept change, in marriage, in industry, in politics. If women could reason, they might also demand rights. The laboratory was not the only battleground. Every school, every household, every dinner table became a site of quiet negotiation. One Victorian commentator wrote, "We will not fear the clever woman, provided she remains gentle." The sentence captured the era's compromise. Intellect allowed, power denied. Still, the women who studied under those conditions built the foundation of modern equality in education. They carried notebooks, not protest banners. Their revolution was written in ink, not shouted in the streets. As the century closed, the question, should women think too much, was fading from science but not from society. It would linger in classrooms, in marriage advice, and in the silent rules of respectability for decades. And yet, one question remained unanswered. If the very act of thinking could change a life, what might happen when a whole generation of women decided to think freely? You are now in 1895. London glows with electric light for the first time. Steam trains thunder through tunnels beneath the city, and typewriters clatter in offices once reserved for men. The debate that began with skull measurements and female delicacy is losing its grip, but it has not disappeared. Like old wallpaper, it peels slowly. At Cambridge, women still study under restriction. They attend the same lectures as men, take the same exams, and often score higher. Yet they receive only certificates of participation. Their degrees are withheld. The excuse is tradition. The truth is fear. Emily Davies, the founder of Girton College, calls it a polite injustice. She continues her campaign with quiet persistence. Her tone is measured, her arguments clinical. She avoids outrage because outrage disqualifies women in the public mind. Calmness becomes strategy. Each letter she sends to Parliament, each meeting she arranges with the University Council, is an act of resistance disguised as civility. Outside the lecture halls, the argument moves into newspapers. Lady doctors are becoming a symbol of modernity. The first hospitals run by women open in London and Edinburgh. They treat poor women who would never enter a male doctor's office. Critics call these hospitals dangerous experiments. Yet their results are undeniable. Maternal death rates fall. The science of childbirth improves. Still, the phrase "too much study harms a woman's nature" persists. It lingers in sermons and etiquette manuals. You can find it printed between recipes and embroidery advice. Old beliefs do not vanish. They fade by habit. A new voice begins to emerge, quiet but firm. Florence Nightingale, long known for her nursing reforms, writes privately about education. "The brain is an organ like any other," she notes. "Use strengthens it. Neglect withers it." Her notebooks, discovered after her death, reveal a woman who understood that logic and compassion could coexist. But she, too, faced resistance from doctors who preferred to label female intellect as nervous energy. Across the Atlantic, Mary Putnam Jacoby's medical research gains renewed attention. Her meticulous data on women's physical endurance becomes impossible to dismiss. Harvard, Yale, and Johns Hopkins slowly open medical programs for women. The delicate brain theory fractures under the weight of evidence. Even so, science finds new ways to disguise prejudice. Instead of arguing that women's minds are weak, some claim they are different. The new phrase, complementary intellect, appears in journals. It suggests that women excel in empathy and intuition, while men dominate logic and invention. This idea feels modern, but it merely rearranges hierarchy. Equality remains elusive, trapped behind politeness. At the same time, the machinery of empire is changing how people think about knowledge. Telegraph operators, typists, and teachers, many of them women, fill the growing bureaucracy of the British Empire. They copy reports, translate messages, and manage correspondence from India, Africa, and the Caribbean. Their work sustains the empire's communication network. Ironically, while science debates whether women can think, the empire runs on their thought. Publicly, the old scientists fade into the background. Henry Maudsley retires, his theories already outdated. His writings still circulate in medical libraries, but younger doctors quietly ignore them. The field moves on to neurology, psychology, and psychiatry, disciplines that will later inherit their own biases. Pseudoscience rarely dies. It mutates. In literature, the educated woman becomes a new archetype. Writers like George Gissing and Olive Schreiner portray her as serious, lonely, often misunderstood. The educated woman is not a monster anymore, but neither is she fully accepted. Society watches her with fascination, waiting to see if she will marry or wither. In 1897, Cambridge holds a public vote to decide whether women should be granted degrees. Crowds gather in the courtyard. Male undergraduates march with banners that read, "No women at Cambridge." They shout and jeer. When the motion fails, they celebrate by pulling a cart through town carrying an effigy of a woman student. They burn it in the street. From her room at Girton, Eleanor Sidgwick watches the fire from a distance. She writes in her diary that night, "Progress is slow, but minds once awakened do not sleep again." Her words carry no anger, only certainty. You imagine her walking through the empty corridors of the college. The lamps hum softly. The walls hold the quiet of decades of study. She knows she may not see the victory in her lifetime. Yet she also knows that defeat cannot last forever when ideas have already entered the bloodstream of a society. The turn of the century brings change. The women's suffrage movement gathers momentum. Scientists begin to question the biological determinism of the past. The weighing of brains and the measuring of skulls give way to psychology, a field that admits ignorance where earlier men claimed certainty. By 1919, after the First World War, British women gain partial voting rights. Universities open their degrees to them in full. Cambridge follows in 1948, long after the original campaigners have died. When you look back, the debate seems ridiculous. That learned men once argued that thought could damage a woman's womb feels like comedy. But it was not comedy for those who lived it. It shaped who could speak, who could study, who could dream. The delicate brain theory did not vanish completely. It survived in quiet forms, in how schools guided girls toward appropriate subjects, in how doctors described ambition as anxiety, in how the workplace defined confidence as aggression. The idea still whispers today, though softer. You sit in that same imagined lecture hall again, now empty and silent. The chalkboard remains. The diagrams of skulls fade in the dust. The air smells of history and forgetting. The debate is over, but its echoes linger. If women thinking too much once threatened the order of the world, perhaps that fear was never about the brain at all. Perhaps it was about what happens when half of humanity begins to question who defines truth. And so you wonder, quietly, as the lamps dim and the sound of the city fades beyond the window. If thinking could once be called dangerous, what other ordinary acts still wait to be declared too much? Tell me in the comments. The corset and the classroom, how fashion restricted female education. Picture a young woman in 1880s London. She wakes before dawn, her maid drawing the curtains against the fog. She dresses for school, or for what passes as school for girls of her class. Her clothes are beautiful but heavy, layers of linen, wool, and whalebone. Her corset cinches her waist to 18 inches. Her ribs ache before breakfast. You can almost hear the tug of the laces. The maid pulls until her arms tremble. The girl's breathing shortens. Her spine straightens, but not by choice. Every morning begins with discipline before she even opens a book. Victorian England believed clothing shaped character. A straight posture meant moral strength. A small waist meant refinement. A calm face under pressure meant self-control. The corset was not just fashion. It was training. It taught stillness, endurance, and silence, qualities also expected of women's minds. Education, too, was meant to shape, not expand. For middle-class girls, school often meant a small room in a private house where a governess taught sewing, French phrases, and polite conversation. Arithmetic came last, if at all. Physical exertion was discouraged. Running, shouting, or laughing too hard could loosen the stays. Doctors warned that excitement disturbed digestion. When reformers began to open serious schools for girls, they met resistance not only from universities but from fashion itself. Parents feared that study would spoil their daughters' looks. A lady's mind, one magazine advised, must never outgrow her figure. At Cheltenham Ladies' College, founded in 1853, this conflict became visible. This headmistress, Dorothea Beale, believed that women deserved intellectual rigor equal to men's. She introduced Latin, geometry, and science. Her students sat at desks instead of embroidery frames, but she could not abolish the corset. It remained part of the uniform, demanded by parents who equated looseness of dress with looseness of morals. Beale tried to compromise. She required looser stays and encouraged walking outdoors. Some students fainted during exams, not from nerves but from lack of air. Reports of female fatigue spread quickly in newspapers eager to question whether women were suited for higher learning. The irony went unnoticed. Society blamed study, not the steel cage beneath their dresses. By the 1860s, physicians began to link fashion to health problems. Dr. William Buchan, a Scottish physician, warned that tight lacing displaced organs and weakened the lungs. He was not a feminist. He simply observed that fainting fits were common among fashionable women. Yet his warnings met ridicule. To criticize the corset was to challenge respectability itself. Advertisements promised that a proper corset preserves grace without harm. Some brands claimed medical approval. The fashion industry and science moved in lockstep, each defending its own authority over women's bodies. Still, reformers persisted. In 1875, the Rational Dress Society formed in London. Its mission was simple: clothing should not deform or endanger health. They proposed health corsets with flexible whalebone and adjustable laces. The idea sounded radical. Newspapers mocked them as the petticoat philosophers. Yet something was changing quietly. As women entered teaching and office work, comfort began to matter more than ornament. Typists, telegraph operators, and school teachers could not perform their jobs while gasping for breath. Their work required motion, focus, and hours of sitting upright. Corsets softened. Materials changed from steel to elastic. In art and literature, the corset became a metaphor. Pain disguised as beauty, control disguised as elegance. Writers like George Eliot and Elizabeth Gaskell hinted at its symbolism, the physical expression of mental constraint. But even they wore it because not wearing it meant scandal. The corset was a social contract. A woman who removed it rejected not just fashion but identity. You might imagine this contradiction in the classroom. A girl studies geometry while her ribs press inward. Her teacher speaks of freedom through learning, yet both of them can barely breathe. Progress and restriction exist in the same room, bound together by stitching and lace. By the 1880s, medical students, some of them women, began studying the long-term effects of tight lacing. They dissected the torsos of deceased women and found compressed livers, displaced stomachs, and curved spines. These findings circulated in medical journals, but few read them outside hospitals. Fashion had its own inertia. Meanwhile, the image of the educated woman shifted again. Instead of being mocked as unfeminine, she was now told to maintain elegance while thinking. Magazine covers showed women reading in corsets, proof that intellect could coexist with beauty if properly contained. Society had found its compromise: think but gracefully, breathe but lightly, move but not too fast. In the end, education and fashion became allies in shaping Victorian womanhood. Both demanded discipline, both required endurance, and both were controlled by men, tailors and teachers who decided how tight the rules should be. Yet beneath the layers of linen and bone, something else was happening. A quiet resistance. A generation of women began questioning not just what they were taught, but what they were forced to wear while learning it. As steam trains carried students from rural towns to city colleges, the corset came with them, a symbol of everything progress had yet to undo. Each laced waist was both an achievement and a reminder. The paradox was simple but heavy. To gain access to knowledge, women had to dress like they didn't need it. How long could they keep pretending? You are now in 1892. The sound of iron wheels echoes across England as women travel to new colleges in long skirts and heavy boots. The corset still rules beneath their blouses. It is invisible but absolute. Every young woman wears one, whether she studies medicine, teaches in a school, or works behind a typewriter. Doctors still debate whether the corset protects posture or destroys it. Some claim it prevents nervous agitation. Others warn it suffocates ambition. Yet neither side asks the women themselves. At Cheltenham Ladies' College, Dorothea Beale writes another circular to parents. She asks them to permit looser clothing. Her tone is cautious. Health, she writes, is the first condition of duty. Some mothers agree. Others accuse her of encouraging immodesty. A headmistress must move carefully. Too much reform and donors withdraw funds. Inside the college dormitories, girls whisper about the reform movement. Some secretly loosen their laces at night. One student jokes that she learns more from removing her corset than from Latin class. Laughter becomes a small act of rebellion. In London, a different group of women is fighting the same battle from another angle. The Rational Dress Society continues its campaign. They organize small exhibitions to display their new clothing, dresses with elastic waists, bloomers for cycling, and the so-called Liberty bodice. These garments look shocking in public but feel like breathing for the first time. Lady Florence Harberton, one of the movement's founders, writes in her pamphlet that the corset is an enemy to education, for how can a woman learn when her lungs are bound? Her statement is mocked in the press. One critic replies, "A woman who abandons her corset abandons decency." The laughter is nervous, not confident. The old order feels threatened. At the same time, universities quietly expand their facilities for women. Girton, Newnham, and Bedford College grow. Yet their students remain symbols of contradiction. Photographs show rows of young women in high collars, sleeves buttoned to the wrist, waists cinched tight. They look dignified, fragile, controlled. The mind may wander, but the body must remain still. The corset defines social class as well as gender. Working-class women cannot afford multiple layers or professional fittings. They tie rough cloth or string around their waists instead. For them, the corset is not luxury but imitation, a way to appear respectable. The poorest women wear none at all and are scorned as loose. Respectability has a price measured in whalebone and pain. Doctors begin to record the symptoms of what they call corset disease: shortness of breath, digestive distress, misaligned ribs. But these symptoms overlap with the vague condition of female weakness, which itself is blamed on education, menstruation, or moral decay. In the confusion, fashion escapes blame. You can imagine a young woman studying at her desk late into the night. Her candle flickers as she leans forward, but the corset pulls her upright again. She cannot bend comfortably, cannot exhale fully. She rubs her side and continues copying her notes in careful script. The discomfort becomes part of learning. In polite society, fainting remains fashionable. A fainting woman shows sensitivity, refinement, and delicate nerves. Yet in classrooms, fainting becomes an inconvenience. Teachers quietly open windows and bring salts. They rarely mention the cause. To speak against the corset is to question civilization itself. Meanwhile, in Paris, medical schools admit women earlier than in Britain. French female doctors begin publishing reports on the dangers of tight lacing. They argue that it restricts blood flow and damages internal organs. Their papers appear in English journals, but few take them seriously. British readers dismiss the French as improper and too modern. The irony deepens. By 1895, the corset evolves again. Manufacturers produce the health corset with flexible steels and a more natural waistline. They market it as the perfect compromise, comfort without rebellion. Women buy it eagerly. Feels different, but the principle remains. The female form must still be shaped, still controlled. At the same time, a subtler rebellion spreads through art and literature. Illustrators depict women in looser clothing, sketching, reading, walking outdoors. Writers describe heroines who reject tight lacing as a sign of independence. The rational dress becomes a symbol of intelligence and freedom. Still, for most women, change arrives slowly. They cannot simply discard their corsets without consequence. Fashion governs employment, reputation, even marriage. A woman without a corset may be seen as ill or immoral. The reformers understand this. They call for gradual transition, not sudden revolt. In classrooms across Britain, small signs of progress appear. Gymnastics becomes part of the curriculum. Teachers encourage deep breathing. The idea of the strong woman begins to replace that of the fragile lady. Yet every movement forward comes with resistance. Newspapers warn that athletic girls may grow coarse or unfeminine. The link between the corset and the classroom remains symbolic but real. Both teach endurance under pressure. Both mold behavior to fit invisible rules. One letter from a student in 1898 captures the contradiction. We study to expand our minds, yet we are bound at the waist. Perhaps freedom must begin where breath begins. By the dawn of the 20th century, the corset's dominance begins to crack. Bicycles, new jobs, and urban life demand mobility. Fashion adapts reluctantly. Elastic replaces steel. The female form shifts from hourglass to upright. Designers call it natural elegance, but the meaning is deeper. For the first time in 2 centuries, women can fill their lungs without shame. Still, the question remains. If clothing could shape thought for so long, what else in society remains unseen, binding people quietly while they believe they are free? It is now 1905. Electric lamps hum softly in London's new schools. Girls sit at desks with notebooks and fountain pens, dressed not in the stiff satin of their mothers, but in blouses that allow the shoulders to move. The corset is still there, but lighter. The air feels different, more breathable. Progress, like fashion, happens stitch by stitch. The Rational Dress Society holds another meeting. Attendance is small, but the mood is hopeful. Photographs from that year show women in reform gowns, their waists relaxed, their smiles unforced. These are the quiet architects of comfort. Their work does not make headlines, yet it changes the rhythm of everyday life. Meanwhile, at Girton and Newnham, students debate science, history, and philosophy without fainting. The link between education and female fragility begins to crumble. Teachers notice improved focus and fewer illnesses once looser clothing becomes acceptable. The connection is simple. When you can breathe, you can think. Medical opinion shifts, though not without hesitation. Some doctors now argue that rational dress promotes circulation and posture. Others cling to old beliefs about the moral benefits of tight clothing. A London physician writes, "Discipline of the body leads to discipline of the mind." He fails to see the irony that freedom of the body leads to clearer thought. In households across Britain, mothers still insist their daughters wear corsets to church or formal dinners. Respectability does not surrender easily, but a divide is growing between generations. Young women entering universities and workplaces choose flexibility over form. They buy Liberty bodices, undergarments made of soft cotton with no steel. Advertisements call them sensible. For once, sense is fashionable. Clothing becomes political. Suffragettes march in tailored jackets and plain skirts, outfits made for walking and speaking, not decoration. Their image shocks society. No frills, no fainting, no permission. They move as they please, and that movement terrifies the old order. In 1910, the first corsetless gown appears at a fashion show in Paris. The audience gasps. The silhouette is straight, natural, and almost modern. Critics call it scandalous. Supporters call it liberation. The design spreads quickly, though in Britain, it takes longer to reach the classroom. Inside universities, new rules allow women to sit for the same exams as men. The discussions about women's mental strain now sound outdated. Yet the memory of those arguments lingers in tone and expectation. Women are praised for intelligence, but only if they remain calm, graceful, and pleasant. Echoes of the corset in speech and behavior. A former Girton student, writing in 1912, recalls her years under the old rules. "We wore whalebone to class and carried our textbooks like fans, careful not to bend. When we loosened our laces at night, we also loosened our fears." That small relief felt like victory. The corset does not vanish overnight. It evolves. By the 1920s, elastic girdles replace it entirely. Women dance, work, and drive without restriction. The modern body, mobile, practical, alive, emerges from 2 centuries of confinement. But the symbolism remains. The idea that women must be shaped, contained, or softened for society's comfort never disappears completely. It shifts from clothing to culture. The history of the corset and the classroom is not about fashion alone. It is about control disguised as beauty. The same logic that tightened the waist also limited education. It taught that perfection required pressure, that discomfort proved virtue. For generations, women learned to breathe shallowly, physically and intellectually. Freedom arrived quietly. No single protest toppled the corset. It collapsed under the weight of daily defiance. A button left undone, a ribbon loosened, a body refusing to conform. By the mid-20th century, corsets survive only as costume. Museum glass separates them from living bodies. Their stiff frames look absurd beside modern clothing. Yet, when you stare at them long enough, you recognize their message. Every era invents its own version of the corset, something to bind the body or the mind in the name of order. The difference now is awareness. You know the pattern. You can see the stitching. You can choose to unlace it. As the lamps dim in that imagined classroom, you picture a student closing her notebook. She stands, stretches, and takes a deep breath, her ribs expanding freely. The faint ache of history lingers, but the air feels lighter. Perhaps progress is not measured by invention or war, but by the simple act of breathing without fear. The mind and the womb, strange theories of female hysteria. It is 1850 in London, the center of empire and medicine. You sit in the dim gallery of a lecture hall at Guy's Hospital. The air smells of disinfectant and coal smoke. A doctor in a black coat stands before a chalkboard, lecturing on a condition that no one fully understands but everyone believes in: hysteria. The word sounds scientific, but it comes from the Greek hystera, meaning womb. To Victorian doctors, the uterus was not an organ. It was an engine of chaos. They believed that when it wandered, swelled, or grew restless, it caused everything from mood swings to madness. You hear the students laugh quietly as the lecturer explains that hysteria can make women weep, faint, or desire too much attention. He says it calmly, as though describing the weather. The notes they take will later guide their practice, their marriages, and their politics. Victorian medicine prided itself on observation. Yet hysteria was built on imagination. Doctors recorded hundreds of symptoms: crying, laughing, fatigue, insomnia, headaches, and inappropriate curiosity. If a woman asked too many questions, she risked a diagnosis. This was convenient. The label of hysteria covered everything that society could not explain or tolerate in women. A wife who refused her husband, a student who wanted a career, a widow who read too much, all became patients. Treatment often began with rest. The most famous prescription came from Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, an American physician admired in England. His rest cure required complete bed rest, isolation, and a diet of milk and meat broth. Women were forbidden to read, write, or think deeply. Energy must return to the womb, he said. Many patients broke under the silence. One of them, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, later wrote The Yellow Wallpaper, a short story that exposed the madness of such treatment. Her narrator, confined to a bedroom with barred windows, slowly loses her mind. The story is fiction, but it describes real therapy. In Britain, the rest cure spread among middle-class women. Doctors called it scientific. Husbands called it necessary. Patients often called it unbearable. They were trapped between medical authority and social expectation. To resist was proof of illness. At the same time, new machines entered the story. Early physicians believed that hysteria resulted from nervous congestion and could be treated by inducing paroxysm, a euphemism for orgasm. Since this was improper to discuss, they framed it as mechanical therapy. Hand-powered vibrators appeared in clinics, used by doctors to calm patients. The device was marketed as medical equipment, not pleasure. Victorian restraint masked human need behind clinical words. Hospitals in London, Paris, and Edinburgh all kept wards for nervous women. Some patients stayed for months. Their records list causes like reading novels, excessive imagination, or mental strain from education. The treatments were endless baths, sedatives, or minor electrical shocks to restore balance. A few doctors doubted the diagnosis. Jean-Martin Charcot, at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris, photographed his hysterical patients as part of neurological study. His images, meant to prove science, looked like theater: women arching, trembling, fainting on cue. He believed hysteria was real but neurological, not moral. Yet his lectures turned the condition into spectacle. Audiences of male physicians applauded as women reenacted their fits. One of Charcot's students, Sigmund Freud, attended these sessions. He would later reshape hysteria into psychology, claiming it arose from the mind, not the womb. But in Victorian London, that shift had not yet come. The body still carried the blame. The idea of female instability fit neatly into a society built on control. Men worked in factories and offices. Women managed households and emotions. If a woman stepped outside her role, the diagnosis waited. It transformed rebellion into illness. Meanwhile, women themselves began to question the theory. Florence Nightingale, recovering from illness after the Crimean War, noted that many cases of female weakness were caused by boredom, not biology. "Inaction is the greatest disease of women," she wrote, but no one quoted her in medical journals. For doctors, hysteria was profitable. It justified long treatments and reinforced authority. For society, it was convenient, kept women quiet. For women, it was suffocating. You imagine one patient, a young governess named Clara, sitting in a doctor's office. Her complaint: fatigue, irritability, and restlessness of spirit. The doctor nods, prescribes rest, and tells her to stop thinking of higher education. Her nerves, he says, are too sensitive. She leaves the room silently, knowing protest would prove him right. This is how hysteria survived, not through evidence, but through repetition. Every diagnosis strengthened belief. Every cure that failed could be blamed on the patient's disobedience. By the 1880s, hysteria had become both medical category and cultural joke. Comedies showed fainting women clutching smelling salts. Novels described them with sympathy or mockery. The image was everywhere: weak, emotional, unpredictable. The same stereotype that shaped fashion and education now had scientific endorsement. Yet beneath the surface, cracks formed. Women doctors, newly licensed, began to challenge the idea. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson and Mary Putnam Jacobi argued that female nerves were no more fragile than male ones. They demanded research instead of superstition. Still, superstition dies slowly when it benefits power. And so, as the century closed, the disease that wasn't real continued to ruin real lives. A diagnosis that began as theory of the womb became a weapon against the mind. But the question lingered, quiet and dangerous. What if hysteria said more about the fears of men than the health of women? The year is 1887. London hums with telegraph lines and carriages. The age of machines has arrived, yet medicine still clings to mystery. The mind remains a frontier, and women's minds are its most suspicious terrain. In hospitals, the diagnosis of hysteria expands. It is no longer confined to noble women or patients of leisure. Factory workers, servants, teachers, and even nurses fall under its reach. Any woman who cannot bear the pressure of her station, or who questions it, risks being called hysterical. Medical textbooks describe hysteria with poetic vagueness. An affection of the nerves, one writes, produced by mental or uterine irritation. The language is soft, almost polite, but beneath it lies control. It says, without saying, that female emotion must remain under surveillance. Doctors write as if they are explorers mapping a dangerous landscape. The female body is their territory. The uterus is their compass. The cure is obedience. In drawing rooms across England, polite conversation includes stories of nervous ladies. Families describe cousins who read too much or widows who speak too boldly. The tone is indulgent, not cruel. Pity replaces respect. At the same time, the medical industry grows. Private asylums open for rest cures at high prices. Physicians visit upper-class homes with portable equipment, electrical stimulators, vibrating devices, inhalers. They treat exhaustion with new technology. Electricity becomes a symbol of modern medicine, though no one understands what it actually does. A pamphlet from 1888 advertises electrotherapy for the nervous female. It promises renewed calm and vigor. The procedure involves attaching small wires to the patient's abdomen and thighs, sending mild shocks through the body. It is meant to restore balance. Some women report relief, others pain, but all are told the treatment is progress. Meanwhile, women working in poorer districts receive a simpler remedy: opium. Apothecaries sell it under names like soothing syrup and mother's friend. It dulls pain and emotion alike. Many become dependent. A quiet epidemic of addiction spreads among women expected to feel nothing and endure everything. Medicine and morality intertwine. Clergymen preach about the dangers of female restlessness. They warn that education, politics, and ambition disturb the natural order. Doctors echo them, claiming that too much mental labor heats the brain and cools the womb. The church and the clinic become partners in preservation. Yet in the background, something shifts. A few doctors begin to see hysteria not as disease but as symptom of confinement, silence, and monotony. One, Dr. George Beard, coins the term neurasthenia, or nervous exhaustion. It affects men and women alike, often from overwork. This reframing softens the gender bias, but not by much. When a man collapses, he is overworked. When a woman does, she is hysterical. The paradox deepens. The empire demands strong women to run schools, hospitals, and colonies, yet its science insists they are fragile. The contradiction becomes a quiet strain in the national psyche. Britain prides itself on rationality while clinging to myth. In the colonies, the theory travels abroad. British doctors in India and Africa diagnose hysteria among both British women and local patients. They interpret fatigue, rebellion, or grief through the same lens. The wandering womb becomes a metaphor for disorder anywhere imperial control is questioned. The body becomes empire in miniature, something to rule, discipline, and correct. Back home, London's theaters begin dramatizing madness. Plays feature women collapsing, trembling, or fainting into men's arms. The audience applauds, not realizing they are watching the stage version of medical theory. Art imitates diagnosis. In literature, hysteria becomes fashionable. Henry James, Thomas Hardy, and others write female characters whose intellect destroys them. The clever woman is punished by nerves. The sensitive woman dies beautifully. It is a pattern that comforts a culture afraid of change. But inside real hospitals, the tone grows colder. Electric currents replace sympathy. Mechanical treatment replaces talk. One patient's record at Bethlehem Hospital reads, "Mild shocks administered daily. No improvement. Continues to speak of books." Another, "Excessive melancholy. Advised silence and milk diet." These women disappear quietly into the paperwork of history. Their names fade, their pain becomes data. At the same time, small rebellions continue. Women doctors like Elizabeth Blackwell and Sophia Jex-Blake publish articles questioning the foundation of hysteria. They ask for controlled studies, not moral lectures. Their requests are ignored. The medical journals are edited by men who dismiss such criticism as sentimental. Yet progress leaks in, as it always does. By the 1890s, the word hysteria begins to lose its certainty. Some physicians now treat it as a nervous condition, others as emotional trauma. The term fragments. Its authority weakens. The cracks widen with each question. What if the problem is not in the womb but in the world? What if hysteria is not illness but protest, the body rebelling against silence? The doctors do not have answers. The empire of nerves begins to tremble. It is now 1901. Queen Victoria has died. The empire continues, but the old certainties are cracking. Science moves faster than belief can follow. Electricity powers lamps, railways connect continents, and medicine begins to doubt its own convictions. Hysteria, once the queen of female illnesses, is starting to lose her throne. In the offices of London physicians, the word remains on prescription pads, but its meaning has blurred. The diagnosis no longer carries authority, only habit. Doctors use it when they do not know what else to write. Patients know it too. Hysteria becomes a polite word for discomfort, despair, or disobedience. You imagine one patient, Eleanor, a schoolteacher. She enters the consulting room with trembling hands. The doctor asks her about her husband, her sleep, her thoughts. She says she feels tired and anxious. He listens with professional detachment and writes a familiar note. Mild hysteria. The treatment. Rest, milk, no reading after supper. Eleanor nods but does not obey. At home, she writes secretly in her journal. That small act, ink on paper, is rebellion. The revolt against hysteria is not loud. It unfolds through observation, through reason, through writing. Charlotte Perkins Gilman publishes essays demanding that doctors treat women as minds, not wombs. In Paris, Freud and his colleague Joseph Breuer published studies on hysteria, claiming the illness stems from emotional repression, not anatomy. It is a radical idea, though imperfect. Freud believes that women's symptoms arise from suppressed desires. His theories still center male interpretation, but they shift the blame from the body to the mind. For the first time, the hysterical woman becomes a subject worth listening to. Patients are asked to speak. Talking itself becomes treatment. This is the birth of psychotherapy. The irony is sharp. The illness used to silence women now teaches doctors to hear them. In Britain, some physicians resist this change. They argue that listening only encourages imagination. But younger doctors are curious. They study case histories instead of skulls. The old image of the wandering womb fades, replaced by the idea of the troubled mind. The difference seems small, yet it changes everything. At the same time, women's movements grow louder. Suffragettes chain themselves to railings, speak in public, and write pamphlets against laws that define them as dependents. Their critics call them hysterical. The insult is familiar, but now it fails to intimidate. To be called hysterical is almost a badge of persistence. In 1908, the British Medical Journal publishes a letter from an anonymous female physician. She writes, "If hysteria is rebellion, then perhaps we have misnamed it. What appears as illness may simply be the body's protest against confinement." The letter stirs quiet debate. No reply follows, but the sentence circulates in small circles of reformers and writers. Meanwhile, hospitals change slowly. Nurses receive better training. Bed rest becomes shorter. Doctors stop prescribing complete silence. The talking cure spreads. Hysteria becomes less visible, less fashionable, less profitable. Yet the shadow remains. The language of nerves survives in subtler forms: female sensitivity, nervous disposition, emotional temperament. These are the descendants of hysteria, stripped of Latin but heavy with the same doubt. In art and photography, the image of the hysterical woman transforms from spectacle to symbol. Painters depict women gazing directly at the viewer, neither fainting nor ashamed. Their stillness looks powerful, not sickly. The posture that once signaled collapse now suggests defiance. By 1920, hysteria has vanished from official medical textbooks. Psychiatry replaces it with terms like anxiety disorder and conversion neurosis. The language changes, but the memory lingers. Generations of women had lived under a diagnosis that never existed, confined by authority that called itself science. When historians look back, they see the absurdity clearly. The theories of wandering wombs and nervous energy read like superstition. But for the women who lived it, the harm was real. They were silenced, drugged, confined, or dismissed, not because they were unwell, but because they were inconvenient. And yet, within that injustice, something unexpected emerged. Out of hysteria came psychology. Out of oppression came conversation. The very effort to control women's minds opened a path toward understanding them. The diagnosis that began as denial of thought ended as recognition of it. You can almost hear the echo of a century closing, the creak of an asylum door, the scratching of a pen in a woman's hand, the quiet breath of someone who has finally been allowed to speak. The question that haunted Victorian science has turned inside out. It is no longer what is wrong with women's minds, but what did society fear about them? As the city quiets outside your window, you realize the lesson of this long, strange chapter. Every age invents its own kind of hysteria. Each one dresses it in new words, but the purpose is the same: to explain away discomfort, to tame difference, to pathologize dissent. And so you wonder, as the lamps dim and your eyelids grow heavy, what future historians will say about the illnesses we invent today, and who we invent them for. The forgotten female scholars of Cambridge who weren't allowed degrees. It is a cold morning in Cambridge, 1897. The cobblestones are slick with rain. and the air smells of ink, coal, and damp wool. You stand before the grand gates of the university, where hundreds of men rush to lectures. The women, fewer in number, walk quietly in the opposite direction. They are students too, but not officially. They attend the same classes, write the same papers, and pass the same exams, yet the university refuses to call them graduates. The rule is simple: women may learn, but they may not belong. Girton and Newnham colleges, the two women's colleges at Cambridge, stand just beyond the main city. Their buildings are handsome but modest, their grounds separated from the ancient colleges that dominate the skyline. The women who study there live under constant watch, by their teachers, by the press, and by public opinion. To study here is not only a privilege, it is an act of rebellion. Imagine the daily routine. A young woman wakes in her narrow dormitory room. Her desk is cluttered with Latin texts and mathematical notes. She lights a candle, puts on a shawl, and walks to class, head down to avoid stares. Her professor lectures without looking at her. When the exam comes, she writes for hours, her hand cramped and ink-stained. She finishes with relief, only to learn later that her name will not appear on any list of graduates. She has succeeded, but officially, she does not exist. This is the quiet injustice of Cambridge in the late 19th century. Women can sit for the same examinations as men, but their results carry no legal weight. They cannot use the title Bachelor of Arts. They cannot apply for fellowships or teaching posts. Their brilliance ends at the edge of the parchment. Emily Davies, founder of Girton College, predicted this struggle. "We must work," she wrote, as though recognition were certain, even when it is denied. Her students took that instruction seriously. They dressed plainly, spoke carefully, and carried themselves with precision. Every gesture had to prove discipline. A single misstep, a rumor, a flirtation, a fainting spell, could be used to argue that women lacked the temperament for scholarship. The male undergraduates were divided. Some sympathized, others mocked. A common joke in the newspapers called them the blue stockings. Clever girls who knew too much and smiled too little. Caricatures showed them with thick glasses and unflattering gowns, their intelligence made into comedy. Even so, their numbers grew. By 1895, over 400 women attended lectures at Cambridge. They studied philosophy, mathematics, and natural sciences. Their exam scores matched or exceeded the men's, but the Senate of the university, an all-male governing body, refused to change the statutes. They argued that granting women degrees would damage the dignity of the institution. To outsiders, the debate seemed endless. To the women inside it, each term felt heavier. The effort of working without recognition created a fatigue deeper than physical tiredness. They did not seek fame, only fairness. Yet fairness moved slower than reason. In April 1897, the question of women's degrees came to a vote. The town prepared for it like a festival. Banners hung from windows. Newspapers printed predictions. Male students organized demonstrations. Some rode bicycles through the streets waving flags that read, "No women at Cambridge." Others paraded an effigy of a woman scholar, which they later burned. Inside Girton and Newnham, the mood was quiet but tense. The students tried to continue their studies, but the noise from town reached them through the open windows. They heard chants, laughter, and the dull roar of the crowd. The night before the vote, one student wrote in her diary, "We will not win tomorrow, but someday someone will." She was right. When the Senate voted, the motion failed by a wide margin. The university declared that women could continue to attend lectures and sit for exams, but degrees would remain reserved for men. The announcement was met with cheers outside and silence within. That evening, Newnham students held a small service. They read poetry, sang hymns, and spoke softly about perseverance. Some wept, others smiled through exhaustion. They had lost the vote, but they had not lost their purpose. A Cambridge newspaper printed the next day's headline, "Victory for Tradition." Below it, a smaller note, "The ladies behaved admirably." The word admirably carried the weight of dismissal. The women of Girton and Newnham continued their work. They published research, tutored other women, and trained future teachers. They lived on half pay and twice the scrutiny. Each achievement required proof that intellect did not destroy femininity. Each essay, each experiment became an argument for existence. By 1900, several universities, London, Manchester, and Birmingham, began granting women degrees. Cambridge remained firm. "We are not hostile," the council wrote in a report, but cautious. Caution in this context meant delay. And so, decade after decade, the forgotten scholars walked the same path. Study, succeed, and then step aside. You picture one of them now, standing in front of King's College Chapel as evening bells ring. She listens to the sound fade over the river. She knows she will never graduate, but she also knows something more dangerous, that knowledge itself cannot be revoked. Still, one question lingers in the cool air. If truth depends on permission, is it really truth at all? It is 1908. The bicycles still roll down Trinity Street. The same bells still echo from Great St. Mary's, and the women still study without recognition. 11 years have passed since the Great Vote, but Cambridge remains unchanged. Tradition sits heavier than stone. At Newnham College, a small group of women gather each evening in the library. The lamps glow softly against shelves of books stamped with the names of men who built the canon: Plato, Newton, Darwin. The women whisper among themselves about the future. Their essays are brilliant, their experiments precise, yet the university still treats them as guests. Each term ends with the same ritual humiliation. The exam results are posted publicly, with the women's names written in a separate list labeled examination results for the women's colleges. They are forbidden to attend the official ceremony in the Senate House. The men receive parchment and applause. The women receive paper copies, folded quietly and delivered by hand. Still, they persist. They study late into the night. They form study circles, share notes, and critique each other's essays. Their resilience becomes habit. They no longer study for degrees. They study because thinking has become survival. The professors who support them do so carefully. Henry Sidgwick, one of Cambridge's most respected philosophers, teaches women privately. He knows the university's limits but believes reason cannot remain divided by gender. If truth exists, he writes, it must be open to all minds. His lectures at Newnham are quiet acts of rebellion. Yet others see danger in this equality. A senior fellow at Trinity writes, "Too much learning unsettles the feminine spirit. It replaces grace with logic." His words circulate widely. For every supportive voice, there are 10 that warn of chaos. In the wider world, Britain is changing. Women enter the workforce in growing numbers. The suffrage movement marches through London. Newspapers call them radicals, even criminals. Cambridge responds with silence, fearing association. The university prides itself on neutrality, but neutrality always favors the powerful. Inside the colleges, the students live under strict rules. Lights out by 10. No unchaperoned meetings with men. No public speaking without permission. Their minds are free only on paper. But even on paper, they must write cautiously. The language of ambition remains coded. A woman cannot declare her ideas boldly. She must phrase them as questions. The most brilliant among them is Philippa Fawcett, daughter of Millicent Fawcett, the suffragist. In 1890, she scored higher than any man in the Cambridge Mathematical Tripos examination. The newspapers called it the woman who beat the senior wrangler. Yet the university refused to list her officially. She was recorded only as above the senior wrangler. A nameless victory, her achievement travels through whispered admiration. For the students who follow, it becomes legend, proof that intellect has no gender. As the years pass, these women become teachers, writers, and reformers. They build careers in other universities that grant them the titles Cambridge denied. Still, many choose to remain in Cambridge, teaching in unofficial roles, haunting the very halls that excluded them. They become the university's conscience, present, essential, and invisible. In public life, their story is almost unknown. The newspapers focus on politics and empire, not on the quiet revolution in lecture rooms. But within academic circles, the debate never truly ends. The male students grow used to sharing classes with women. Some even defend them. Yet when the question of degrees arises again, the older professors hesitate. They say it is not time. They say the world is not ready. In 1911, another campaign begins. The women of Girton and Newnham petition the Senate once more. They gather signatures, write pamphlets, and meet sympathetic MPs. The tone remains polite, but the patience is thin. They have spent decades proving what should need no proof. During these years, the world beyond Cambridge shifts violently. The suffragettes chain themselves to railings, hunger strikes shake prisons, and the streets fill with banners demanding equality. The women of Cambridge watch from afar. They are scholars, not militants, but their cause is the same. Inside the colleges, the atmosphere tightens. Some professors quietly advise the women to wait until the storm has passed. Others warn that association with activism will harm their progress. Yet progress without pressure has never arrived. One evening in the library, a student writes to her friend in London, "We study Plato, but live like shadows. We know the forms of justice, yet cannot touch them." Her letter captures the contradiction of her time, educated minds without recognized existence. When war breaks out in 1914, the question of women's degrees fades into the background. Many female students volunteer as nurses, translators, or clerks. They handle logistics, correspondence, and care for wounded soldiers. The war exposes the absurdity of their exclusion. If women can manage hospitals and handle coded messages, how can they not qualify for a degree? The irony does not escape them. As shells fall in Europe, the walls of Cambridge seem smaller, older, and more fragile than ever. The women return after the war to find the university unchanged. The gates still close them out of official ceremonies. The Senate still debates with the same caution. The logic that once justified exclusion has worn thin, but habit remains powerful. Still, the question grows louder. How long can a university dedicated to knowledge deny knowledge itself? Drop your thoughts in comments. It is May 1921. The sun falls softly on the courtyards of Cambridge. The city is calm, but something electric moves beneath the surface. After years of petitions, essays, and exhaustion, the Senate has again called a vote on whether women should finally be granted degrees. The atmosphere feels familiar, almost ritual. Students hang banners from windows, newspapers prepare headlines, and the women of Girton and Newnham wait quietly behind their walls. They have waited for decades, through war and peace, through progress everywhere but here. This time, the world seems different. Women have served in hospitals and factories during the Great War. They have voted in national elections since 1918. Even Parliament has accepted what Cambridge still debates. It feels like the moment should finally arrive. Inside the Senate House, the debate begins. The speakers stand beneath the carved ceiling, their words echoing off centuries of tradition. Supporters speak of fairness, logic, and justice. Opponents speak of order, custom, and the unique spirit of Cambridge. One professor warns that granting degrees will unsettle the dignity of the university. Another claims it will invite frivolity into scholarship. Outside, a crowd gathers. Women stand in silence, their faces unreadable. They know the words by heart. They have heard them all before. The vote is taken. The results are read. The motion fails. Cheering erupts, not from the women, but from the men who flood the streets in celebration. They parade through town, waving flags that read "No Women at Cambridge." They carry an effigy of a woman scholar through the streets once again, dressed in academic robes, and burn it near Market Hill. The flames rise, the crowd laughs, and the smell of smoke drifts toward Newnham. Inside the college, students sit in the library in silence. No speeches, no tears, just the sound of pages turning. The librarian records the day in her ledger with a single line. Degrees refused once more. Later that night, a small group walks by the river. The lamps reflect on the water. One of them whispers, "We will outlive them." And they do. The decades that follow are slow but relentless. The women continue to teach, to write, to research. Their work fills journals. Their students rise to prominence. Their names circulate quietly through the corridors of academia. Each generation builds on the one before. By the 1930s, the resistance softens. The university can no longer deny the reality of women's contribution. Even male fellows who once opposed the reform begin to question themselves. The argument that women lack discipline sounds absurd next to their published papers. Yet it takes until 1948, almost 80 years after the founding of Girton, for Cambridge to finally grant women full degrees. By then, many of the pioneers have died. The ceremony is held with quiet formality. No parades, no protests. The newspapers call it a correction of an old omission. A few surviving early students attend, now elderly and bent with age. They wear academic robes for the first time. As they walk into the Senate House, the younger students stand in applause. The sound fills the chamber like an overdue echo. One of them, Eleanor Sidgwick, who had once written that progress is slow, but minds once awakened do not sleep again, receives her honorary degree with trembling hands. She smiles slightly. For her, this moment is not triumph but closure. The records show that nearly 900 women retroactively received degrees that year. The university's official minutes list them by name, but not by story. Each entry hides decades of work, of silence, of patience. Afterward, one journalist writes, "Cambridge has finally caught up with its women." That sentence, dry and factual, closes an era. But the story of those forgotten scholars lingers far beyond the ceremony. It becomes part of the architecture, unspoken but felt in every classroom where women now sit as equals. The irony of history is that the women who fought hardest for recognition never needed it to prove their worth. Their knowledge survived without the university's approval. Their names, once omitted from parchment, now line the halls they once entered as ghosts. You can imagine them walking again down Trinity Lane in your mind's eye, not as visitors, not as curiosities, but as the rightful owners of their own intellect. The degrees came late, but the dignity was always theirs. And so, as you listen to the quiet hum of the river and the fading chime of the college bells, a question rises from the past, gentle but firm. If recognition can be delayed for 80 years and still arrive, how many truths today still wait, quietly, to be believed? Tea, typewriters, and temperance. The office women who changed science. It is London, 1895. The city hums like a machine. Telegraph wires stretch across rooftops. Trains rattle through tunnels. And every business now depends on paperwork. The Industrial Revolution has reached its second stage, not powered by steam, but by pens. The empire runs on documents, and those documents need to be written. Enter the office woman. She arrives early, walking past clerks in bowler hats who glance at her with curiosity and confusion. She wears a plain blouse, a long skirt, and sensible boots. Her corset is lighter than her mother's, her pace quicker. She carries a leather case with pencils, paper, and hope. Inside the office, the air smells of ink, dust, and ambition. The typewriter, that new machine of keys and levers, sits on the desk waiting. Few men want to use it. It feels domestic, too much like a sewing machine. So employers hire women, claiming their nimble fingers suit the work. Sounds like flattery, but it is convenience. Women are paid less, praised little, and yet they fill every empty chair. Within a decade, they transform the office from a male sanctuary to a mixed world. Banks, shipping firms, law offices, and scientific societies all begin to rely on them. By 1910, 1 in every 10 clerical workers in London is a woman. They are called typewriters, the same name as the machine. Their presence unsettles old habits. Victorian men are used to servants, not colleagues. Offices, once loud with tobacco smoke and casual profanity, now fall silent. The women are watched constantly, their handwriting judged, their posture inspected. A smudge of ink or a crooked page can mean dismissal. Yet, behind that quiet, they are changing everything. The growth of bureaucracy creates a new kind of intelligence work. Files, statistics, and correspondence require order. Women who can read, calculate, and summarize become indispensable. Some advance to positions of responsibility: supervisors, librarians, assistants to scientists and engineers. They handle data long before data becomes a word of power. One such woman is Hertha Ayrton, an engineer and physicist. Though not an office woman in title, her early career mirrors theirs. She worked as a tutor, patent drafter, and researcher, moving between drawing rooms and laboratories that barely tolerated her. Her research on electric arcs and airflow earned respect abroad before Cambridge acknowledged her. She showed that precision work, once dismissed as clerical, was the foundation of invention. In quieter corners of science, women perform invisible labor that fuels discovery. They copy measurements, tabulate experiments, and manage correspondence for famous men. At the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, lady computers calculate astronomical data night after night. Their names rarely appear in publications, but their numbers do. For them, the typewriter is not just a tool. It is a symbol of access. It bridges two worlds, the domestic and the intellectual. Typing gives them entry into spaces once closed to women. It allows them to handle information, to know things they are not supposed to know. But even progress has limits. The office is not a democracy. Wages for women remain half those of men. Advancement stops at the level of senior assistant. Marriage often ends a career. Employers fear that wives will neglect their husbands if they work full days. To justify these limits, society invents moral cover. Magazines claim that women work for pin money, a harmless pastime before marriage. They are described as temporary helpers, not professionals. The typewriter, once a tool of liberation, becomes a prop for respectability. At the same time, another movement rises alongside them, the temperance movement. Its meetings fill church halls and town squares. Many of its leaders are office women and teachers. They see drink as the enemy of order and opportunity. In their view, sobriety is not just moral, but practical. A sober man keeps his job. A sober woman keeps her mind. The overlap between typing and temperance is no accident. Both demand discipline. Both promise respect in exchange for restraint. For many women, self-control becomes survival. The office rewards calm, not creativity. Every letter must be exact. Every gesture must be proper. The smallest mistake can confirm a prejudice. Still, something is shifting. These women may seem modest, but they are the first generation to earn wages for thinking. Their earnings, small as they are, give them a kind of independence unknown to their mothers. They rent rooms, buy books, and save for education. Some use their pay to fund scientific study at night. In this way, the office becomes an invisible school. It trains minds in logic, memory, and precision. It teaches responsibility and timekeeping, the same skills that will later build laboratories, libraries, and universities. By 1900, even critics admit that the female clerk is essential. Yet they never call her intellectual. They call her tidy, patient, and loyal. These are safe words chosen carefully, but under them knowledge grows. The quiet rustle of papers and the rhythm of typewriter keys mark a revolution so calm that no one hears it. Still, you might wonder, as you listen to the steady tapping, what happens when the people who keep the records start to write history themselves? The year is 1907. The offices of London hum like beehives. You hear the rhythmic clatter of typewriter keys from behind every frosted glass door. The sound is constant, precise, almost musical. Each stroke marks the rise of a new class of worker, the woman clerk. Inside these rooms, rows of desks stretch like lines in a ledger. Women sit straight-backed, hands poised above black metal machines. Each letter must strike evenly, each sheet free of smudge. The supervisor walks between the rows in silence, listening. The soft hum of typewriters has replaced the rough laughter of men. Efficiency has become virtue. The office is not a battlefield, but it is a place of quiet survival. Many of these women come from modest families. Their education ends at 16, their wages start low. Yet, for them, this is freedom. A weekly salary means rent paid, meals chosen, and small independence. In the city's narrow rooms, freedom begins with 10 shillings and a desk of one's own. They live carefully. Breakfast is weak tea and toast. Lunch is eaten from paper wrappings at the edge of a desk. At 5 o'clock, they leave together, neat and invisible, walking past gentlemen who barely notice them. But the city is theirs in ways it never was before. Some of them carry books instead of handbags, manuals on shorthand, arithmetic, or chemistry. Evening schools in Bloomsbury and Kensington fill with clerks determined to rise. After typing reports all day, they attend lectures at night, learning what the men upstairs earn twice as much to forget. A few succeed. They move from typing letters to managing them, from recording experiments to conducting them. One becomes a librarian for a scientific society and later co-authors a paper on soil bacteria. Another, a clerk for an observatory, learns enough mathematics to calculate orbits. Their work is buried in footnotes, but their precision keeps entire institutions running. For many others, progress stalls against invisible walls. The men they assist rarely see them as equals. One typist recalls her employer telling her, "You have a fine mind, Miss Carter. Pity it's wasted on typing." She smiles, says nothing, and continues to type the next page of his speech. That is the paradox of the age. Women could touch knowledge but not claim it. They could organize thought but not lead it. They carried science forward line by line, yet history remembers only the signatures at the bottom of the page. The typewriter, once a novelty, becomes a symbol of submission and power at once. It requires skill, patience, and rhythm. It leaves no room for opinion. Yet behind the click of the keys, women build mental endurance. They learn clarity, brevity, and control, the very principles of modern science. Outside the office, the temperance movement grows stronger. Clerks and teachers fill its ranks, preaching not only sobriety but self-respect. To them, temperance means more than avoiding drink. It means discipline against chaos, order against neglect. They see the drunk husband, the dismissed worker, the wasted wage. To these women, morality is mathematics. They calculate every penny and every consequence. Many employers support the cause, believing sober women make better workers. Temperance meetings are encouraged. Tea replaces gin. Offices begin offering tea breaks instead of ale breaks. The ritual of tea becomes a moral anchor, a pause between labor and respectability. But beneath the polite surface, the movement divides. Some women see temperance as empowerment, others as control. Promises virtue but demands conformity. To be respectable, one must be predictable. The office woman learns to measure her emotions as carefully as her words. Still, progress slips in through the cracks. The typewriter opens doors to government offices, law firms, and laboratories. The number of female clerks doubles between 1900 and 1910. They handle census data, patent filings, and hospital records. Their work supports the foundations of modern administration. During this time, scientific institutions also begin hiring women as assistants to catalog data. At the Royal Society, women process research notes for physicists and chemists. In botanical archives, they classify plants sent from colonies around the world. Their names appear in ledgers but not on publications. The men receive medals, the women receive wages. One young woman, Annie Russell Maunder, starts as a mathematical assistant at the Royal Observatory. She helps photograph the sun's surface and calculates solar cycles. When her work contributes to new theories of sunspots, her husband, a fellow astronomer, signs the papers. For decades, her contributions are hidden behind his name. Only later will historians uncover her initials in the margins of drafts. Stories like hers echo across the century. They show how every typed report, every copied calculation, and every polished document shaped the progress of science more than anyone realized. These women were not revolutionaries in the streets, but architects of structure. They built the systems that organized knowledge. They kept the empire of information from collapsing under its own weight. Still, they were not free. A single misstep, a rumor, a complaint, a late arrival could end a career. Respectability remained both shield and chain. The office, for all its order, remains a cage lined with paper. Yet inside it, small rebellions grow. A woman stays after hours to study physics notes. Another types her own stories under the company letterhead. Another sends a paper to a journal under initials that hide her gender. Each act is quiet. Each is enough to shift the future by a fraction. And as the century edges closer to war, those small fractions begin to matter. The world is about to discover how much it depends on the hands it never noticed. It is 1916. The Great War has turned the world into a ledger of losses. In the offices of London, the typing never stops. Telegrams arrive by the thousands, lists of the wounded and the dead. Men are at the front. Women fill their places behind desks. The quiet clerical revolution that began with tea and typewriters now runs the empire's machinery of war. Every ministry and laboratory depends on them. They record troop movements, draft supply orders, and tabulate casualties. In the Ministry of Munitions, women compile production statistics for artillery shells. In hospitals, they type medical reports, patient records, and experimental data for new antiseptics. The typewriter becomes a weapon of logistics. Every key press carries consequence. Many of the typists are the same women who once faced scorn for working at all. Now, the same society that doubted their strength praises their steadiness. Our women keep the war organized. One newspaper declares, the praise feels hollow. It arrives only when men are gone. Yet the war changes everything. For the first time, women's labor becomes essential, visible, and undeniable. The government trains thousands of female clerks and technicians. They learn to file, code, and calculate with military precision. The army calls them the mechanical mind of the empire. Scientific offices feel the change most. Laboratories that once dismissed female clerks now depend on them. At the Royal Institution, women copy experiment logs, measure compounds, and prepare research notes for publication. They work side by side with chemists and physicists, yet their pay remains the same as before. In one such lab, a young typist named Kathleen works for a chemist researching explosives. She types his data charts by day and studies chemistry textbooks by night. When the chemist falls ill, she continues his work in secret, calculating the reaction rates herself. Her numbers are correct. Her report is published under his name. No one ever knows. Stories like hers multiply quietly across the empire. For every discovery celebrated, there is a woman's invisible labor beneath it. When the war ends, the men return, and the dismissals begin. Offices that had run smoothly under female clerks now announce that women must make room for returning soldiers. The government calls it restoration of order. For many women, it feels like betrayal. Still, something irreversible has happened. They have seen their competence measured in crisis. They have learned that they can think, manage, and endure. The memory of that knowledge cannot be erased. The 1920s bring new machines, new expectations, and new debates. Dictaphones replace some typists. Adding machines simplify accounting. Yet, even as technology evolves, the shape of clerical work remains feminine. Society has decided that precision, patience, and repetition are women's skills. The praise is faint, but it keeps the doors open. Meanwhile, in scientific institutions, women continue to push forward quietly. They compile geological surveys, manage medical archives, and assist in early computing work. Their titles, assistant, secretary, recorder, hide the reality of their contribution. In Cambridge, at the Cavendish Laboratory, clerks transcribed the experiments of Ernest Rutherford's team. Later, when nuclear physics takes shape, the same clerks will handle calculations that define the new science. Their names will not appear in textbooks, yet every result depends on their accuracy. Outside the office, society shifts again. The temperance movement fades after the war, replaced by a new message: efficiency. Women are no longer told to be virtuous, but to be useful. The language changes, but the demand for obedience remains. Still, quiet defiance endures. A generation of office women begins writing in their spare time. Some publish novels under initials. Others join early computing projects. They are no longer content to type what others think. They start to think for themselves. By the 1930s, the image of the female clerk evolves again. She is modern, professional, and essential. The office has become her domain. The typewriter, once a symbol of subordination, now marks her identity. Her tea break is her meeting. Her shorthand notes are history in waiting. Her patience is policy. Her precision, progress. In time, these skills will build something greater than anyone expects. When the next war arrives, their daughters will not just type reports, they will program machines. The quiet order of the office will give birth to modern computing, led again by women, still underpaid, still underestimated, but impossible to erase. The typewriter was never just a machine. It was the sound of an unrecognized revolution. Steady, repetitive, unstoppable. And if you listen closely, you can still hear it in every keyboard today, the echo of those forgotten fingers tapping out the framework of modern knowledge. The Curious Case of Mary Somerville and the Invisible Mathematicians. It is 1826, long before women could attend university or publish freely. You stand in a quiet room in London, lined with books, globes, and glass instruments. A woman sits at a small desk, copying equations from a French text. Her hand moves steadily, her eyes bright behind thin spectacles. Her name is Mary Somerville. Few people outside the scientific world know her name, yet nearly every educated person in Britain will one day read her work. She translates mathematics into language ordinary readers can understand. She connects physics, astronomy, and philosophy. She explains the universe. But at this moment, she is invisible. Born in 1780 in Scotland, Mary Fairfax grew up in a house where girls were not expected to think deeply. Her father, a naval officer, believed education ruined women's modesty. Her mother taught her domestic skills. Mary's early lessons were simple: sewing, prayer, and quietness. At 10, she discovered algebra by accident. A puzzle in a magazine mentioned a symbol she did not recognize. Curious, she asked a tutor what it meant. The man scolded her. "Such studies are not for young ladies," he said. That answer lit the spark that would define her life. She began teaching herself mathematics in secret, studying by candlelight after everyone slept. Her only tools were borrowed books and scraps of paper. When her parents found out, they confiscated her texts. They called her obsession unfeminine. Her first marriage to Captain Samuel Gregg offered no encouragement. He told her that learning was a waste of time for a wife. When he died young, Mary found herself with 2 children and a small income, and, for the first time, freedom. She remarried in 1812 to Dr. William Somerville, a physician and scientist who admired her intellect. He gave her books, instruments, and, most importantly, respect. Together they moved to London, where Mary began corresponding with leading scientists. Her reputation grew quietly. She solved mathematical problems published in journals, often anonymously. In 1826, she presented a paper on the magnetic properties of sunlight to the Royal Society through her husband's name. Women were not allowed to attend the meetings. The breakthrough came when she decided to translate and explain Mécanique Céleste, a complex treatise by the French mathematician Pierre-Simon Laplace. His book was legendary for its difficulty. Even trained scientists struggled to follow it. Mary Somerville spent 4 years translating and clarifying it, line by line. Her version, published in 1831 as The Mechanism of the Heavens, astonished readers. It turned Laplace's dense equations into elegant English explanations. The book became the foundation of scientific education for decades. The British press praised her cautiously, calling her the most learned woman in Europe. The Royal Society admired her but did not admit her. Scholars cited her work but avoided her name. She existed between 2 worlds, admired but unacknowledged, known but not welcomed. Mary's drawing room became a quiet center of scientific exchange. Astronomers, mathematicians, and philosophers visited her home to discuss ideas. Her conversation was sharp but gentle. She spoke with calm authority that made men forget, for a moment, that they were supposed to doubt her. Her second major book, On the Connection of the Physical Sciences, 1834, shaped modern scientific thinking. It proposed that all fields of science, astronomy, physics, chemistry, geology, were linked by underlying principles. The idea seems obvious now, but it was revolutionary then. It influenced figures like John Herschel and even inspired William Whewell to coin the word scientist. Before that, natural philosopher was the common term. Yet, even with such influence, Mary Somerville remained an outsider. She could not join professional societies. Her research was introduced by male colleagues. When she received a government pension for her work, critics called it excessive generosity. They could not believe a woman's intellect deserved a salary. Her story is not unique. Across Europe and America, other women studied mathematics and astronomy in similar isolation. Some were wives of scientists, their labor hidden under their husbands' names. Others were computers, hired to perform calculations without credit. But Mary's persistence set her apart. She lived to see her books used in universities that still would not admit her gender. She saw her ideas taught to students who would never know her name. When she died in 1872 at the age of 91, she left behind a library of notes and formulas. Her obituary in the Times described her as a woman of singular modesty and singular intellect. The world remembered her as exceptional, though she was only the first visible member of a long line of invisible mathematicians. You can imagine her now in that quiet room, turning the pages of Laplace's text by lamplight, whispering the language of the stars in words the world could finally understand. Still, one question lingers in the soft rustle of paper and ink. How many other minds, equally bright, worked in silence beside her, their names lost to the margins of men's books? It is 1835. London's scientific world is a closed circle of gentlemen. Its meetings are private, its publications expensive, and its authority absolute. Inside that circle, Mary Somerville remains an anomaly, a woman whose intellect demands attention but whose presence defies protocol. Her latest book on the connection of the physical sciences has spread across Britain. Young engineers, amateur astronomers, and teachers use it as a guide. Its language is clear, its structure calm, its purpose revolutionary. It proposes that nature is not a set of separate mysteries but a single, interconnected system. For the Victorian mind, obsessed with order, this is both comforting and dangerous. The Royal Society acknowledges the book's brilliance but not its author. She receives letters addressed to Mr. Somerville. When corrected, correspondents apologize, surprised that a woman could produce such work. She laughs privately but never corrects them harshly. Politeness remains her armor. Meanwhile, her drawing room becomes an invisible laboratory. She corresponds with scientists across Europe: Laplace, Arago, Herschel, Babbage. Her letters travel farther than she ever could. She discusses magnetism, the tides, and the orbit of Neptune before it is discovered. At her desk, the tools of science are modest: a quill, a ruler, a telescope borrowed from a friend. She cannot enter the observatories herself, but her mind moves freely through the heavens. Around her, a quiet network of women begins to form. Some she knows, most she does not. They are translators, assistants, and teachers. They work in the shadows of the scientific age. In Germany, Caroline Herschel continues her work in astronomy. She catalogues nebulae and comets, her discoveries credited to her brother William. She receives a royal pension, the first woman in history to do so for scientific work, but her reputation remains secondary. She writes in her diary, "I wish to prove that I am useful for something more than to make shirts." In France, Sophie Germain hides behind the pseudonym Monsieur Leblanc to correspond with mathematicians. When her true identity is revealed, she is denied entrance to the École Polytechnique, but continues to send papers from home. Her research on elasticity and number theory earns respect only after her death. In America, Maria Mitchell, a Quaker from Nantucket, becomes the first woman astronomer recognized internationally. She reads Somerville's books in secret as a teenager. When she discovers a comet in 1847, she names it Miss Mitchell's Comet. Harvard offers praise, not position. These women, separated by oceans and languages, share the same pattern of existence: visible ideas, invisible lives. Their work proves that intellect thrives wherever it is allowed to survive in silence. Mary Somerville never calls herself a feminist. She avoids public controversy. Yet every page she writes is an act of quiet rebellion. She shows that science is not a gender but a method. Her calm defiance influences a generation of women who begin to teach science in schools and write for journals. Her correspondence with John Stuart Mill, philosopher, economist, and later champion of women's rights, strengthens the intellectual bridge between reason and equality. Mill cites her as proof that ability is not bound by gender. When he writes The Subjection of Women, her example stands behind his arguments. Meanwhile, Mary continues her research. She studies planetary motion, magnetic fields, and the connection between light and electricity. Her conclusions anticipate future discoveries. Yet she publishes sparingly, fearing that bold speculation might be seen as arrogance. Her restraint is strategic. In Victorian science, modesty opens doors that ambition closes. She writes with careful humility, presenting her ideas as summaries of men's theories even when they are her own. Her readers admire her tact without realizing it hides defiance. By the 1840s, she is one of the most respected scientific writers in Europe. Queen Victoria grants her a civil pension of £200 a year, an enormous honor for a woman. Critics call it excessive charity. They never use the word earned. Her influence spreads far beyond her lifetime. Cambridge and Oxford students study her texts for decades. American universities list her works in early syllabi. The crater Somerville on the moon is later named in her honor, a gesture she never lived to see. But the most enduring monument is the community she inspired. Across the 19th century, women who read her books begin to see themselves differently, not as intruders in science, but as its rightful participants. Still, their names vanish in footnotes. Mathematicians like Ada Lovelace, who collaborates with Charles Babbage, credit Mary Somerville as their example. Yet Lovelace's own reputation will be buried for a century. The pattern repeats. Discovery followed by erasure, brilliance followed by silence. In Mary's final years, she writes her autobiography. It is simple, factual, and free of bitterness. She describes her love for numbers as others might describe their faith. Mathematics, she writes, transports the mind to a region of order and beauty. At 90, nearly blind, she continues to calculate planetary orbits by hand. Her notebooks remain tidy, her handwriting firm. Visitors describe her as serene, her mind untouched by age. Her story proves that exclusion does not end intellect, it refines it. Deprived of laboratories, she turned her home into one. Denied a classroom, she educated a century. And when she could not be seen, she made herself impossible to ignore through the clarity of her thought. Still, one question remains, drifting quietly over the centuries of her influence. If Mary Somerville's calm precision could alter the language of science from her sitting room, how many revolutions of knowledge have passed unnoticed in the rooms next door? It is 1871, 1 year before Mary Somerville's death. She sits by a window in Naples, where she spends her final years with her daughters. The Mediterranean sun fills the room, the air warm and still. Her eyesight fades, yet her mind remains sharp. She dictates letters, rereads notes, and corrects proofs of her last book, on molecular and microscopic science. Outside, Italy unites under a new government. Inside, Mary unites ideas. She connects chemistry, electricity, and magnetism in a way few men dare. Her theories will not all survive time, but her method, seeing order where others see fragments, becomes the soul of modern science. At 91, she works as if deadlines still exist. The habit of inquiry, she says softly to her daughter, is stronger than the habit of rest. Her death that following year closes one life but opens a new chapter for others. Her funeral in Naples is small and quiet. There are no grand speeches, only the sound of waves against the shore. Her tombstone bears a simple inscription. Here lies Mary Somerville, who dedicated her life to the pursuit of truth. The simplicity feels fitting. She had no need for monument or title. Her life itself had been the argument. But the story does not end there. Across Europe and America, young women studying mathematics carry her books under their arms. In Edinburgh, a group of female students, nicknamed the Edinburgh Seven, cite her as inspiration as they fight for admission to medical school. In America, Maria Mitchell includes her writings in her lectures, calling her the clearest mind of our century. Her influence grows quietly, like a current beneath the surface. Universities begin to mention her in syllabi. Astronomers refer to her translations when teaching celestial mechanics. Each citation, each mention, pulls her name from the margins toward the center. By the early 20th century, her legacy merges with the next revolution, computing. The women who calculate trajectories at observatories and, later, at NASA, follow the same lineage. Disciplined, unseen, precise. Their methods, order, patience, pattern mirror Somerville's. They are the intellectual descendants of her quiet defiance. In 2016, Oxford University names a college after her, Somerville College, originally founded in 1879 as one of the first for women. It becomes a home for future scientists, including Dorothy Hodgkin, who wins the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, and Margaret Thatcher, who studies chemistry before entering politics. Each of them walks paths cleared, invisibly, by Mary Somerville's example. The arc of history bends slowly, but it remembers clarity. Even so, the larger truth remains uneasy. For every Somerville the world eventually honors, hundreds of others remain unnamed. The invisible mathematicians, who filled the 19th century, left no autobiographies. Their work exists in margins, footnotes, and anonymous translations. A single missing signature turned lives of intellect into silence. Archives reveal fragments, initials in the corner of diagrams, women listed as assistants, pages corrected in unfamiliar handwriting. Each trace hints at another voice hidden beneath the surface of discovery. When modern historians revisit these documents, they begin to recognize the scale of that invisibility. Entire theories once credited to great men turn out to be collaborations. Letters reveal wives, sisters, and daughters performing calculations, checking proofs, and refining arguments. Science, long described as solitary genius, begins to look more like a collective endeavor, one where credit follows power, not accuracy. And yet, in this web of erasure, Mary Somerville endures. She survives not through noise, but through precision. Her prose is so clear that it cannot be misquoted without being noticed. Her ideas are so consistent that they outlive the institutions that ignored her. She remains proof that intellect does not require permission. Her calm persistence becomes a model for every scholar who must work unseen. You picture her one last time, at her desk in the fading light, surrounded by papers. She lifts her head toward the window, her eyes tired but unafraid. Around her lies a world she helped explain, though it rarely acknowledged her. The stars she once calculated still move across the night sky with the same precision she described. The equations she copied by candlelight still govern tides and motion. The clarity she brought to thought still shapes how we understand nature. The invisible mathematicians who followed her would build on her foundation, some recognized, most forgotten, but all connected by the same quiet conviction. That knowledge, once discovered, belongs to everyone, even those the world refuses to see. And so you sit, in the calm silence she once knew, thinking of all those who worked in the half-light, their genius recorded only in ink and dust. You can almost hear her voice, faint but steady, whispering across the years. Learn quietly, but never stop learning. How medical textbooks explained why women shouldn't read novels. It is 1858 in London. The streets smell of smoke and damp paper, and the publishing industry is booming. New printing presses make books cheaper than ever. Every shop window glitters with novels by Dickens, Gaskell, and Bronte. People read on carriages, in parks, and at night by gaslight. But not everyone approves. In the drawing rooms of the educated classes, another book circulates quietly, The Female Mind in Health and Disease by Dr. Henry Maudsley. It claims that novels can make women ill. The argument sounds medical. It begins with the word nerves. Victorians use it for everything they cannot explain. Fatigue, sadness, excitement, rebellion. Doctors describe women's nerves as delicate, easily overstimulated by emotion or imagination. To protect them, Society prescribes moderation in all things, including reading. You sit in a lecture hall at the Royal College of Physicians. A professor paces before a blackboard covered in chalk diagrams of the brain. He points to the frontal lobes. Here, he says, is the seat of reason. Men's faculties are enlarged by study. Women's are diminished by it. The students nod. He continues, the novel, that modern fever of the imagination, excites the brain to unhealthy activity, especially in the young. It sounds absurd now, but in the 19th century it is orthodoxy. Medical journals repeat it as fact. The Lancet publishes letters warning that romantic fiction produces nervous exhaustion in females of refined temperament. Doctors recommend literary abstinence for women suffering from melancholy. One physician, Dr. Edward Tilt, writes that the overuse of imagination diverts vital energy from the reproductive organs. The logic is simple. A woman's body is a closed system of energy. To think too much is to rob the womb of strength. At the same time, novel reading becomes a national obsession. Middle-class women, confined to domestic life, find escape in stories of adventure, scandal, and independence. For the first time, fiction gives them inner lives that reach beyond the parlor. They read about women who travel, teach, and question. They begin to imagine more. The medical establishment sees danger in that imagination. A good woman should be pious, practical, and calm. The novel threatens all three. Doctors describe cases of literary hysteria. A woman reads late at night, forgets to eat, and complains of palpitations. Another grows irritable and fanciful after finishing a love story. The prescription is rest, diet, and removal of books. Mothers warn daughters that fiction leads to spinsterhood. Clergymen preach sermons on the corruption of the female mind by romantic fancies. Even respectable periodicals join the chorus. The Quarterly Review calls novels the poison of leisure. Yet the campaign fails. Women keep reading. Publishers know their audience. They market novels directly to the female imagination. Stories of moral struggle and quiet rebellion disguised as entertainment. The very act of reading becomes a form of defiance. Still, medical theory adapts. Since doctors cannot stop women from reading, they classify reading into safe and dangerous kinds. Educational works, biographies, and travelogues are permitted in moderation. Romantic fiction, however, remains suspect. It is said to disturb the humors and weaken the maternal instinct. Some medical texts go further. They warn that constant reading causes cerebral congestion, a supposed buildup of blood in the head. The cure is simple: cold baths, light meals, and no literature. The same textbooks that describe the heart and lungs with precision drift into fantasy when they reach the mind. They treat curiosity as a symptom, not a strength. One influential manual, Diseases of Modern Life by Dr. Benjamin Ward Richardson, lists mental overstimulation from novels beside alcoholism and overwork as causes of illness. The message is clear: imagination is a vice. In girls' schools, teachers take note. Reading lists exclude fiction. Students copy moral essays instead. One headmistress writes proudly, "My pupils prefer sermons to stories." She is probably lying. The irony deepens. At the same time that science expands knowledge, it warns women not to use it. The age of Darwin, Faraday, and Pasteur is also the age of medical superstition about female thought. For every new discovery, there is an old fear that ideas will change those who are not meant to have them. You picture a young woman sitting by a window, reading a book she is not supposed to read. Her hand trembles slightly, not from nerves, but from the thrill of disobedience. She knows that if her mother enters, she must hide the book behind a cushion. She keeps reading anyway. The story is not about illness. It is about imagination, and imagination cannot be diagnosed. Still, the doctors continue to write. They publish warnings, diagrams, and case studies. They believe they are protecting the mind, when in truth they are describing their fear of it. And so, as the 19th century moves forward, medicine and morality become allies in silence. The prescription is simple: fewer books, fewer thoughts, fewer questions. But beneath that silence, something restless begins to grow, the realization that stories themselves might be the cure for a disease that never existed. It is 1872. The debate over women's reading habits has turned from concern into obsession. Every drawing room discussion, every school report, every sermon seems to touch it. The question is no longer whether women should read novels, but how much before harm begins. Doctors claim to have the answer. Medical manuals of the period list symptoms of novel reading disorder. They include insomnia, poor digestion, melancholy, fainting, and domestic neglect. The proposed cure is predictable rest, silence, and simpler reading material. Some even recommend that women return to needlework, claiming it soothes the nerves and restores feminine equilibrium. The phrase feminine equilibrium becomes common in lectures. It refers to the balance between emotion and reason. To the Victorian doctor, women tip too easily toward emotion, and fiction pushes them over. Dr. Henry Maudsley expands his theory in Body and Mind. He insists that women's mental energy is tied to their reproductive cycle. If they spend it on reading or study, he warns, they will suffer intellectual congestion and uterine decline. He writes this without irony, certain that imagination drains the body like fever. These ideas spread fast because they sound modern. The 19th century worships science. Once a claim is written in the language of medicine, it becomes truth. Mothers quote it to daughters. Teachers cite it in classrooms. Ministers use it in sermons. What begins as opinion hardens into rule. By the 1880s, moral reformers publish handbooks listing approved authors for women. History is allowed. Poetry is risky. Fiction must be pure. Jane Austen is safe, the Brontes are not. Sensation novels, those with crime, passion, or independent heroines, are considered toxic. The fear behind these lists is not medical. It is social. Reading allows privacy, and privacy breeds independence. A woman reading silently in a corner is unreachable. No one controls what she imagines. To a culture built on supervision, that silence feels dangerous. Doctors frame their warnings as compassion. Protect the female mind from nervous ruin. They write, keep her thoughts within safe bounds. The paternal tone masks control. The patient is treated like a child who must be guarded from herself. Meanwhile, libraries begin separating collections by gender. Men browse philosophy, engineering, and politics. Women are directed to domestic guides, pious essays, and travel diaries. Librarians justify this division as a kindness to the weaker sex. Yet the more the warnings spread, the more women ignore them. Circulating libraries' record-sharp increases in female borrowers. They read under false names. They share books among friends. The band becomes irresistible. Novel reading even enters medical practice itself. Some women physicians, newly licensed, recognize its psychological value. They describe fiction as emotional exercise, a way to process feelings safely. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell calls it mental ventilation. Her view is dismissed by male colleagues, who accuse her of encouraging hysteria. By the late 19th century, the idea that reading harms women begins to weaken, but not because doctors admit error. It fades quietly, replaced by new labels. Instead of hysteria, the term becomes overwork. Instead of moral weakness, it becomes neurasthenia. The words change, the logic remains. Women who think too much still risk illness. They are simply diagnosed differently. At the same time, novelists themselves strike back. Writers like George Eliot, Elizabeth Gaskell, and Thomas Hardy fill their books with intelligent, conflicted heroines who defy the diagnosis. Their stories turn the stereotype inside out. Women who think are not sick, they are alive. Readers notice. Critics complain that such novels overexcite the female imagination. The phrase, meant as insult, becomes evidence of success. The women reading these books feel recognized, not condemned. Medical language cannot compete with that feeling. By the 1890s, the reading epidemic has turned into a quiet victory. More women write novels, publish essays, and review books. The same medium once blamed for their weakness becomes their platform. But even as the idea dies, its ghost remains. Teachers still warn students to read responsibly. Newspapers still describe educated women as overstimulated. The fear of imagination does not vanish. It evolves into subtle expectations. Be smart, but not intimidating. Educated, but gentle. In the textbooks, the chapter on nervous women shrinks with each edition. Eventually, it disappears altogether. No one mentions it again. The silence feels like progress, but it hides memory. The lie that novels could injure women becomes part of a deeper lesson. That control often disguises itself as care. You picture a doctor closing his medical manual for the last time, its margins filled with fading theories. Somewhere, across town, a young woman finishes a novel, smiling in quiet triumph. The science of silence has failed. Still, one question remains in the fading candlelight. If stories once frightened science, what might happen when imagination starts writing its own textbooks? It is 1903. The British Medical Association meets in Manchester, its hall crowded with doctors in black coats and spectacles. The world has changed since the first warnings about dangerous reading. Trains now carry newspapers to every village. Libraries have multiplied. Cheap paperbacks appear in railway stalls. And women, hundreds of thousands of them, read everything. The doctors discuss new diseases, industrial fatigue, poor sanitation, infant mortality. No one mentions novels. The reading epidemic has quietly died, outlived by its own absurdity. But its influence remains woven into the culture that followed. In schools, girls still read fewer books than boys, not by rule but by habit. In homes, mothers still warn daughters against morbid stories. Publishers still label novels for ladies, as if ideas need decoration. Respectability now wears a smile instead of a frown, but the message is the same. Read, but carefully. Think, but softly. Meanwhile, women writers have turned the old warnings into weapons. Their pens replace the doctor's stethoscope. Writers like Virginia Woolf, Olive Schreiner, and Kate Chopin expose the quiet violence of intellectual control. In essays and fiction, they show that madness and melancholy often begin not in the mind, but in the room where thinking is forbidden. Woolf later calls it a room of one's own, a simple phrase that tears through a century of silence. The private space once condemned as dangerous becomes the symbol of freedom. Looking back, the history of reading illness reveals more than superstition. It shows how science, dressed in confidence, often protects power. When doctors warned that fiction overheated women's nerves, they were not describing biology, they were defending hierarchy. The diagnosis changed nothing about the body, only about who was allowed to use it for thought. Still, progress arrives, as it always does, quietly and unevenly. By 1910, female literacy in Britain approaches 95%. Women read newspapers, philosophy, and even medical journals. Some become doctors themselves, teaching anatomy to men who once quoted Maudsley's theories. Others write novels that dissect society with the same precision surgeons once claimed for the body. The textbook that once warned against imagination becomes a relic. Students skim its pages in disbelief. This language, once confident, now reads like satire. Too much imagination weakens the womb. Romance induces moral fatigue. Each line reveals more about fear than about health. Historians later trace this fear to a single idea, the belief that order depends on ignorance. The fewer people who imagine alternatives, the longer the system lasts. But novels, with their endless what-if, make ignorance impossible. Every page invites comparison, judgment, empathy. For the first time, ordinary readers see lives beyond their own. That is what frightened the doctors most. The irony is complete. The century that tried to warn women away from fiction ends up shaped by it. The rise of literacy, journalism, and popular novels helps build the social